Well, I'm not sure about your daily rhythms of life, but I am one that enjoys a very small afternoon nap. Does anyone join me in this, or a few yeses? I wake up quite early, normally in the day, before 5:15-ish right there, and so about 1:30 to 2 p.m., I'm pretty much done. And the pattern is I just lay right down on my office floor and put an alarm on so I'm not like 4 hours later. About 10 to 12 minutes right there, and I'm just out. And then, even though it's just a short time, it does so much to refresh and renew so I can finish the day strong and be ready to come home and play with the kids and be with the family. One day, this past week, I was doing my normal pattern, went down for the 10 or 12 minutes, got up, and it was surreal. It was one of those naps, I must have been deep in there, because I woke up and I didn't know who I was, where I was, or what I was doing on the floor of this room with all these books. And it took about 5 seconds of looking around going, oh yeah, and all the reality came flooding back in. I don't know if you have moments like that. It was very surreal. Now, imagine this. Imagine waking up, either in the morning or a nap, and you find that all your reality has now totally changed. You find out that your government now sees you as a threat just because of your ethnicity, your family size, and your family background. You are now not loyal citizen, but foreign threat dwelling far too near. Such was the reality for Israel in the end of Exodus chapter 1. This was real for them. And so this is what we'll look at today as we continue on in our trek through the book of Exodus. We began this last week looking at the basics of the book, the beginning of the book, the first 7 verses. Now, as we turn to verse 8 to 22, we're going to finish out chapter 1. And in this section, we will see much that disturbs us, but we'll also see much that gives us hope and peace and rest in who the Lord is and what He's doing. So if you got a bookmark on the way in, you'll see I've divided this text into 2 headings. See first, Pharaoh's fearful distress, verse 8 to 10. This is what the word says. Now there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph. And he said to his people, behold, the people of Israel are too many and too mighty for us. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply, and if war breaks out, they join our enemies and fight against us and escape from the land. So right away, in verse 8, we are told that a new Pharaoh has taken over. This means that a huge political shift has just taken place in Egypt. But though this new king is quite likely, especially at that time, the most powerful person on the planet, do you notice that Moses doesn't even tell us his name? Other people are named in this very passage. People you might think are insignificant. But this guy, significant, powerful king, we don't even know his name. Why? Why are we not told his name? I think it's fairly simple that though this Pharaoh will bring so much threat and distress to Israel in this passage and do wicked act upon wicked act to them as a people, when you compare this Pharaoh to the Lord, he is nothing. He's nothing. I think that's one of the reasons we don't know his name. Moses is subtly reminding us of that. We do know one thing about him in verse 8. He knows not our Joseph. He doesn't know Joseph. There are options here. What does this mean? Does this mean that this new king had no knowledge of Joseph? Or does it mean that he once knew about Joseph but has since forgotten about Joseph? I don't think it refers to either of those things. Rather, I think the phrase "did not know Joseph" refers to this new king's refusal to acknowledge and honor the life and legacy of Joseph in Egypt. The closing chapters of Genesis show us how crucial Joseph was in the survival of Egypt. Without him, we could rightly say, would there even be an Egypt? He was the one that made great storehouses of grain during the famine, a famine so severe that all in the land and even neighboring countries had to come in and get grain to survive. Joseph was so important that the Pharaoh at that time made him his right hand. And the only thing that was off limits to Joseph was Pharaoh's wives and Pharaoh's throne. Everything else was under Joseph's control. You better believe that age, that time, that culture, they honored Joseph. He was a big deal in Egypt, and they would remember his name for a long time for holding the nation together at a time in great famine. But what happened in verse 8? A new king comes, and with a new king comes not only new policies and new procedures, but with a new king comes a new agenda. Out with the old, in with the new. What does this mean for Israel? It meant that they're no longer a favored and loved people, dwelling off securely in the land of Goshen, like the end of Genesis shows. Now they're foreigners in a country ruled by one who hates foreigners. Only a Pharaoh bent on kicking out Israel and destroying and diminishing Joseph's legacy would do the kind of cruel acts that this chapter shows that he does. Bottom line, Israel is in trouble. And that's exactly what we see as verse 9 and 10 come to us as this new Pharaoh, perhaps even right after he comes into power, he gives this great big speech to the nation. And what does he do? He invents a new rhetoric about Israel. He says they're too many, they're too mighty, and they are now a threat to the Egyptian way of life. And with words that sound all too similar to those that were building the Tower of Babel, Pharaoh says, "Come, let us deal shrewdly with them." Plain and simple, these are fear tactics. If our enemies break in, they're going to join with them and then they'll overthrow us all. It's new rhetoric, a new campaign, a new angle on a historic friend that now is seen as an enemy. And so this new king wants to get rid of Israel. And so this is what he does. It's not very surprising to see this, is it? I mean, I think most modern day nations, probably all of them, are suspicious and fearful of foreign outsiders sneaking their way in for some kind of power move. Like they're going to come in and take control, and then everything's going to change about our way of life. This is what the new king is doing. He's sounding the alarm in verse 9 and 10 with a carefully crafted argument to win the hearts of the nation and begin his new campaign to oppress Israel. Before we move on, I want to point something out to you here in the text that I think the English Standard Version, the ESV, one that we generally use a lot here at Sunrise, doesn't do very well with. And I think most translations don't do very well with the end of verse 10. If you look there, it says that Pharaoh wants to deal shrewdly with Israel, lest they keep growing, join our enemies, attack against us, to what? Escape from the land? To me, this is puzzling. Aren't they dwelling securely and contentedly in Goshen? All their needs are provided. They have dwelt there for years and years and years since Joseph came, ruled, and died. They've been there in Goshen, happy and content. Now all of a sudden they want to join foreigners, Pharaoh says, to attack Pharaoh and all his host, to escape from the land. On one hand, this doesn't make sense, but it doesn't need to make sense. Pharaoh, like we've said, I think is inventing new rhetoric to just launch a campaign that he wants to do anyway to get rid of this numerous people that he sees as such a threat. So this doesn't need to make sense. But on another hand, I don't think it makes sense because of the words that are used. That phrase in the original Hebrew, escape from the land, in verse 10, is used in many other places in the Old Testament. And you know what it's never translated as? Escape from the land. Except for right here. Every other place, it's overcome, overthrown, overpowered, or take possession of. So if you reread verse 10 with that translation, I think we understand what Pharaoh is fearing. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply, and if war breaks out, they join our enemies and fight against us and overwhelm us, overcome us, take possession of our land. That seems to make far more sense, and this is exactly what this new king fears. And so this is exactly why in verse 9 and 10 he invents a new rhetoric about a historic friend to really start what he wants to do anyway and kick out and exterminate these Israelites. So we've seen Pharaoh's fear and distress. It's going to get worse here, just a warning. In verse 11 to 22, we'll see his cruel plans. Now be sure to recognize in the back half of this passage, from verse 11 to 22, this is not one grand plan that this new Pharaoh makes, but rather an initial plan that fails, followed by an even crueler plan that fails, followed by an even crueler plan that fails, and then it gets to plan 4 and reaches the heights of cruelty and severity. Then the chapter ends. That's the rest of what's before us. This is sadly similar to the slow progression of the foul treatment of the Jews by the Nazis from 1937 to 1945. They did not begin with Holocaust. They got there. That was likely the intended goal the whole time. But they're not going to start there. They have to start slow. Such is the slow progression of evil, wicked cruelty we see with Pharaoh against Israel. See plan number 1 in verse 11. Therefore, they set taskmasters over them to afflict them with heavy burdens. They built for Pharaoh store cities, Pithom and Ramses. This is Pharaoh's first attempt to stop Israel from growing so numerous. Because they had grown so much and become this new kind of threat, this new king decides to put them to work, afflicting them with not just burdens, but heavy burdens. Specifically, they need to build store cities, cities that only exist to store stuff for us. For these cities to be built, you're thinking, how would this reduce or slow the population of Israel? For these cities to be built, the men would have to leave their families for long extended periods of time, which would cut down on the conceiving of new children if the men aren't there. Also, if the men are away building cities for Pharaoh, who back home is going to take care of the home, the fields, the crops, the herds? I mean, certainly the women are going to have to get busy and do all kinds of double duty here to see that everything is taken care of. But because the men aren't there, there's surely going to be a reduction in not only the rate at which they're multiplying because the men are gone, but perhaps Pharaoh is even thinking that they're going to have a nutrition problem and they're going to grow slowly but surely weaker and weaker because a lot of the people that are going to have to take care of their food now have not done it before, and all of a sudden it's their responsibility, which in turn would create more problems. If the Israelites are going to get weaker, they can't function properly in an Egyptian labor camp, which means the men that are going out to work in these cities are going to look over time weaker and weaker and weaker, and Egyptian labor camps are not easygoing. If you can't keep up, you're just kicked off to the side and left for dead. So this labor camp, the building of these store cities, is Pharaoh's first plan to slowly exterminate the Israelites. Well, what resulted? Look at verse 12. But the more they oppressed, the more they multiplied, and the more they spread abroad. And the Egyptians were in dread of the people of Israel. So not only were they a problem, they're a threat, now they're in dread of Israel. The more their thumb oppresses, the more they're growing. Despite the poor and vexing conditions that Israel was having to endure, they're growing, they're multiplying. Pharaoh shows his blindness in this. There's no worldly explanation, right, for why or how Israel keeps growing in such conditions. Only the Lord can do this. And Pharaoh is blind to this. So what did he do? Plan number 2, verse 13 and 14. So they ruthlessly made the people of Israel work as slaves and made their lives bitter with hard service in mortar and brick and in all kinds of work in the field. In all their work, they ruthlessly made them work as slaves. If you read those verses slower and just linger on each phrase, verse 13 and 14 sound like a chorus of hard labor, where brutality and severity just reverberate and echo and resound all the way throughout the verses. These again are tactics to make the Israelites weak and sick and even cause them to die from such severe work conditions. So surely, Pharaoh's thinking, as the years unfold, plan 1 didn't work. Those store cities are halfway built. They're still growing. Plan 2. Make it harder. Make it more brutal. Make it more severe. Surely, as time progresses, we will see a diminishing, a reduction in the population growth of these foreign people. Right? Well, we're not told explicitly. There's not a verse 14 and a half before we get to verse 15. But there's got to be events and time between verse 14 and 15, because something must have prompted Pharaoh. Something must have told him that plan number 2 is not working, that even the hard, severe brutality is not reducing their numbers, to cause him to then go to step number 3. I think that is what happened. So see plan 3 in verse 15 and 16. Then the king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, one of whom was named Shiphrah and the other Puah, would you serve as midwife to the Hebrew women and see them on the birth stool? If it is a son, you shall kill him. But if it is a daughter, she shall live. So hard and bitter, brutal, cruel slavery has not produced Pharaoh's desired results, prompting him in verse 15 to move from slavery to slaughter. But not by his own hand. No, he kind of does this secretly behind closed doors, it seems, by calling in 2 of the midwives to carry out this foul deed. Questions abound around these midwives. 3 in particular. One question concerns their own ethnicity. Were they Hebrew or were they Egyptian? You're like, geez, Pastor, it says right there, Hebrew midwives. Well, sure, they could have been. But this could also be translated midwives of the Hebrews. Both work. Both are options. So we're left wondering, what were they? If they're Hebrew, did Pharaoh really think that Hebrews would kill their own sons, their own people? Or, if they're Egyptians, did Pharaoh ever really consider that his own people would ever disobey something he commanded? It is difficult to know exactly what their ethnicity is. I think there are good arguments on both sides, but whether they were Hebrew or Egyptian, both positions leads to great difficulty in receiving this command. That's one question. Another question concerns their number. It's a smaller question, but how could 2 midwives handle such a large task? I mean, have we not been told time and time again in just this first chapter that Israel is huge by this point? And you're telling me 2 midwives are supposed to handle this whole thing? I think it's better to see these midwives as roles similar to that of like a head nurse. They're in charge of many midwives. These 2 in particular, Pharaoh just happens to think, are the ones that can be trusted with this dark deed. The last question, and it just gets worse and worse here. Why just the boys and not the girls too? Why just kill the boys? I mean, if you're Pharaoh, think, if all the boys will be killed, and this is long-term thinking, what happens in 10 to 15 years with the next generation's workforce that I'm now oppressing to build all these things? There's not going to be a workforce in a generation if I kill them all off. But perhaps this reveals that Pharaoh's desire to exterminate Israel is greater than his desire to build all these cities and tasks he has for them. which reveals his true heart. He doesn't really just want to make them slaves. He wants them dead. That's his greatest desire. And like other pharaohs in history, right around this time, other peoples were also enslaved. All the men were killed. And what did Pharaoh do? He took all the women for himself. All of a sudden, he had a whole new nation that just functioned as his harem. This is likely what Pharaoh wants to do with Israel. Well, what resulted from this third plan? Look at verse 17 to 21. But the midwives feared God and did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but let the male children live. So the king of Egypt called the midwives and said to them, "Why have you done this? And let the male children live." The midwives said to Pharaoh, "Because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women, for they are vigorous and give birth before the midwife comes to them." So God dealt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied and grew very strong. And because the midwives feared God, he gave them families. As soon as we read in verse 17 that the midwives feared God, we know they're in trouble. Right? They're going to have to explain themselves as they disobey Pharaoh's command. What's going to happen? If you just pause there, you don't know the rest of the story, yikes moment for Shiphrah and Puah. But because they fear God, you see what they do? They will not render to Caesar what belongs to God. So rather than taking life, they preserve it and they protect it. You have to know that it took time, perhaps years, for Pharaoh to realize this new plan was not working. I'm not seeing diminishing numbers in the workforce coming out of Israel. So what in the world is going on? Go get those two and bring them in here. I have to talk to them. So in they come, and what did they do? Did they lie? Did they tell the truth? Did they tell enough of the truth, but not the whole truth? Are the Hebrew women really that much more vigorous than the Egyptian women, such that the midwives can't even get there in time? Some believe that these midwives are horrible liars here. Others do not. That they're heroines. That they have virtue and excellence to see here. Throughout the history of the church, so much debate has happened right around these two women. What did they do? Was it okay? Was it not okay? And how then do we learn from it? It's actually a really good place and plug. Go to small group this week and have fun debating this very question. I don't want to linger on that here because honestly, I don't think that's the point to really lean into. All in all, whatever decision you arrive at there, they faced an impossible choice. But I think the text itself, interestingly enough, gives us the answer to the question in verse 20 and 21. God blesses them for their actions, for fearing him greater and above Pharaoh. Thus we learn it is always wise to obey God, even if that means we disobey an earthly king of any kind. And that's what the midwives did. They were not just some kind of political action group that was eager to defy kings. That was not their heart's desire. They didn't even really want to be just loyal to the Hebrews. They wanted to obey God most of all because they feared God above all. So the story, I think, of these midwives is not the story of liars, but of heroes. Heroic resistance. Why do I say that? We don't even know who this Pharaoh is. We don't get his name. You know who we know the names of? These two women. You'd think in all of history, who do we need to know names of? All the kings and rulers that steer the course of the events of the world. Not two common women that all they do is midwife service. God thinks different. Irony is present here. These midwives, they save families through disobeying Pharaoh. So what does God do? God blesses them by giving them families of their own. At that point, we don't know what Pharaoh did to them. It just moves on in the text to plan number 4. The highest height of cruelty so far. Look at it in verse 22. Then Pharaoh commanded all his people, every son that is born to the Hebrews you shall cast into the Nile, but you shall let every daughter live. Here, the slaughter of the innocents is not told to 2 women behind closed doors. It's told to all the officials of Egypt. That's what it means by his people. All the leaders of Egypt now receive a direct command to cast all the boys into the waters and leave the girls. And that's how chapter 1 ends. Welcome to the book of Exodus. How interesting, right? How interesting. God mocks Pharaoh later in chapter 14. Here, Pharaoh decides and desires to destroy Israel in water. Later at the Red Sea, it will be reversed. As Israel goes through water safe, and Pharaoh and all his host are destroyed by water. You don't mess with the Lord or his people. Again and again and again. God is not Pharaoh. God is God, greater than Pharaoh. And we see it here. But my, oh my, this chapter is difficult. The cruelty of Pharaoh is hard to stomach. Yet as hard as it is, there's one grand lesson that I want to draw out for you as we end today. Church, there is a gospel pattern to see here. I wonder if you see it. As Moses, the deliverer, is born at the start of the next chapter into this dark background, so too the Lord Jesus, our deliverer, is born into a similarly dark background. Both Moses and Jesus, their lives are threatened at birth by the king that's in power. At first secretly and then openly. Both children are rescued in the nick of time while other children are slaughtered in a vain attempt to remove some kind of made-up threat. And so the start of Exodus and the start of the Gospel of Matthew are tragically yet redemptively so similar. The slaughter of the innocents is present in both. Lesson: into our darkness, God sends salvation. This chapter ends with a river running red, with the blood of innocent little boys. It ends in fear and cruelty and silence from heaven, or so it seems. Yet what does chapter 2 begin with? A baby's cry. Is not this often how God works? In the darkest of moments, He's planting the seed of deliverance. When evil is shouting loud, God is whispering through faithful, ordinary acts of ordinary people like these two midwives. This is greater than all the pharaohs of history. God is not absent. He is preparing the way. And so this chapter meets us right where we are. There are many moments of our own lives that feel like the end of Exodus 1, right? Whether it's injustice, pressure, severe, brutal trial, where we feel like life is almost over and wondering if God has forgotten us. Into this darkness, we can take heart. Because God knows, He sees, and the God of Exodus is the God who saves. Just as Moses was born against this dark background of Pharaoh's making, Jesus was born against the dark background of Herod's making. And just as Moses would one day lead Israel out into freedom, so Jesus too will one day come, and for us has come to lead us into freedom. Freedom through His death, through His resurrection, into the great freedom that the children of God enjoy from our sins, from our shame, from all the pharaohs of the world that would ever come against the church. But perhaps we need to remember that the Lord is wise. This is not a rare moment in history, is it, when a king does something like this? God knows when His church needs a ruler over them that, quote, knows not our Joseph. Perhaps to remind us where our true hope really is. It's not in any of these nations, or in their reign, or their campaigns, or their politics and agenda. It's in the country to come that has a king who will live forever, who's greater than any other earthly king, who is never oppressive, never brutal. He's a king of love and grace that no one can mess with. So, church, don't lose hope in the dark. The darker the night, the brighter His redemption and deliverance shines. Hold fast, fear the Lord, look to our great deliverer, the Lord Jesus.